Well, ladies and gentlemen, the news was about to happen. I mean, at the end of the day, Ramaphosa had the G20 and he didn't have a lot of nice things to say about Trump, although not actually directly. He didn't really reference Trump, but he went out of his way to try and embarrass Trump. Well, indirectly. It's very complicated. But before we get on to the video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. It really does help. And if you want to support the work that I do here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. So what happened? Well, Donald Trump has accused the ANC of killing the local people that look like me. Now, I can't actually say that phrase on YouTube because if I do, I get a big, huge warning. That's genuine. It's actually happened before. So yeah, just use your imagination. Now, he says, that's Donald Trump that is, says that they will be blocking South Africa from the G20 in 2026 because the next G20 is occurring in Miami, US. So how did this all go down? Well, Trump posted on Truth Social that the US will stop all payments and subsidies to South Africa effective immediately. Now, I've got to say I was a little bit surprised by this because I wasn't sure we were still going to get any. Remember that he did do a whole thing at the start of the year where he stopped all of the foreign aid, and we were hit quite heavily for that. Now, he claimed on his social media post that the South African government refuses to acknowledge horrific human rights abuses against Afrikaners and Wit-Mensa, descendants of Dutch, French, and German settlers. And he says that they are randomly allowing their farms to be taken. Now, he says that the US boycotted the G20 in Johannesburg summit this year because of this. He says that he accuses the ANC of committing genocide and the media of covering it up. And finally, he says South Africa will not be invited to the G20 in 2026 in Miami. He says South Africa is not a country worthy of membership anywhere. And Elon Musk just had to jump in on this, and he responded going, accurate. That's all he said, accurate. In an allusion to this basically validating Trump's claims in front of his 200+ million followers around the world. So yeah, this has escalated quite quickly. Now, you have to look at this and go, what exactly is going on here? Well, I actually made the prediction that South Africa could lose its G20 status after the G20, and I even speculated, if you watch my videos, on where that might go. The writing was kind of on the wall because Trump has really had his knife out for the US for some time. Now, some analysts are already suggesting that Trump cannot unilaterally block South Africa from the G20 because the G20 is consensus-based. It's not owned by the US. Now, hosting the G20 does not give the rights to the host to remove members. Now, if the US tried to do this unilaterally, it would effectively set a dangerous precedent, potentially collapsing the entire G20 structures. Now, South Africa is a full member of the G20 and not a guest member. It does not require yearly invitations. So effectively, it can go anyway. Now, Donald Trump actually claims that South Africa refused to hand over the G20 properly. Now, you will recall that Ramaphosa said that he would hand over the G20 to an empty chair. This is an allusion to the fact that the US said that they weren't going to go. Now, at a later stage, it was suggested that a minor or junior diplomat would go so that they could hand over. But if you recall from our videos from last week, Cyril basically said he wasn't going to accept that. So the presidency has now officially been handed over to a US embassy representative as per diplomatic protocol, but it wasn't done at the G20. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa has responded to Donald Trump's statement, suggesting that the statements made by him were regrettable, misinformed, and insulting. He says that South Africa will not engage in demeaning or insulting rhetoric towards other nations. Well, buddy, you've been doing that for a very long time when it comes to nations like Israel. Remember, genocidal apartheid state, or are we forgetting all of a sudden? In any case, he says that South Africa is a founding or full member of the G20 with equal status. And he says, you can't really do that to us, we're equal to you. And this itself shows why it's important to have multilateralism and consensus rather than having unilateralism and basically be domineered by the US. Now, he notes that South Africa has made significant contributions to the G20 declaration on global inequality, multilateral cooperation, and developing economies. Now, the government, that's the South African government, insists that Miami snub carries no formal weight, so they're entitled to go to the conference whether he wants them there or not. And the problem is they don't actually have to give you a diplomatic visa to go. So maybe you could be entitled to go. Good luck getting into the country, because you need the cooperation of the state for that. Now, I've got to say, if I look at this objectively, and Biz News has actually done a really good exposure on this, and I'm going to take my hat off to them and say, if you haven't already read that exposure, just go read that. It's very good. But the crux of the matter appears to be the allegation around what we might describe as a Boer genocide. Remember, I can't use the actual word. People that look like me, remember, YouTube will strike me for that. Well, in any case, that appears to be the central issue, whether or not genocide is occurring against those individuals. Now, James Murbury at Biz News exposes an internal BBC bias and attacks a BBC documentary which claims that there is no local genocide, let's call it that. Now, according to James, the BBC documentary minimized 30 years of farm murders by only quoting recent low annual numbers and ignored historical data showing over 1,300 murders in the early democratic period. He claims that the documentary itself used a fake quote attributed to Hendrik Verwoerd to portray Afrikaners as racist. Now, James says that the BBC violated its own guidelines of accuracy and hate-inciting content, and argues that Western media has become hostile to Afrikaners, dismissing rural violence and land fears, and this forms the backdrop of why Trump's genocide message resonates in certain global circles. Now, I've got to say to James, first time, bud. I mean, unfortunately, the BBC has been found guilty of manipulating all sorts of data when it comes to the Gazing issue. I've been highlighting that for some time, and for that I get said, oh, I must be an Israeli shill. No, you don't understand how influential BBC documentaries can be to the global sphere. Now, when you see it, you need to call out the biased nature of the BBC because it is influencing global positions on certain issues. In this instance, it happens to be Boer violence. But we need to look at this slightly objectively before everybody jumps on the bandwagon and go, there's a huge genocide in South Africa. And we're going to quote AfriForum's data. Now, AfriForum's own data does suggest that farm murders are often brutal and very real. Nobody is suggesting otherwise, and if you do, you're an idiot. But they only make up around 0.2% of national murders, and they do include victims of all races. Even AfriForum's leaders have rejected the phrase of a wit mense genocide. Now, farm attacks are often economically motivated. They're not directed by the government. They're not random state expropriations. However, rural safety is a genuine crisis, and it's a crisis that the government is not addressing. In many instances, the rural community is miles away from a local police station. I mean miles. And that's if the police station even has a working van, because in many instances, they don't. So the reality is, crime can occur on a farm and no one is coming to help you. Now, it goes without saying that rhetoric such as the land expropriation legislation does cause widespread fear, because we've seen numerous instances where the local 30%er who's just itching to steal their farms, even gone to certain farms and started trying to measure out for new drapes on the curtains, going, oh, government's going to give me your farm soon. This doesn't help, because what you're effectively doing is encouraging individuals to commit acts of vandalism on their property in the hopes that somehow it will be theirs soon. And we can see numerous instances of this. So in one instance, we have to acknowledge farm crimes are horrendous. They often are brutal and very real, and you cannot get away from that. And the government is doing nothing about it. A lot of it is economically motivated because the individual is in a rural area. That's not to say that there is zero race-related element to it, because there are, and AfriForum has documented numerous instances where there has been a racial component in the crime. But government rhetoric and underfunding of farm or rural communities is often the key to a lot of what occurs, because it's the government's own positions that quite often racialize and aggravate the actual murder itself. And there is no getting away from that. Now, one way that you could effectively stop or minimize farm crime is to grow the economy, because as we've said, a lot of this is actually due, well, effectively to an economic position. These are people that are poor and they need jobs. Now, the government is just retarded because, as you know, one of the biggest problems we have in South Africa is BEE. And BEE itself, according to Malesia Mbeki, has contributed to trillions, billions, whatever you want to call it, of wealth, capital flight out of the country, and a lack of growth. Now, there has been this recent discussion on whether or not an equity equivalent might be considered for South African firms, and this is after Starlink somehow managed to discuss an equity equivalent rather than a straight equity transfer. Now, the Minister for Trade, Parks, has suggested that possibly an equity equivalent could be considered for South African firms, but he said that it must not weaken BEE. Now, he said that the equity equivalents were originally meant for foreign multinationals who didn't want to give up equity. And this is after they became relevant again because Starlink wanted to enter South Africa without ceding ownership. But in typical fashion, it's the ANC factions that warn that allowing this would undermine transformation. In other words, they want their lucre and they want their money. So stop undermining it. Now, Parks actually says that transformation is non-negotiable, which is basically parroting what Sir Ramaphosa says. But he does signal a position shift towards a transformation fund model, which could essentially see BEE moving away from race-based ownership rules, but basically like ownership rules that contribute to a transformation fund, and it would basically be a tax on your business to fund the transformation fund rather than giving away equity. Whether or not that actually gets passed, well, I find that highly doubtful. I suppose it will really depend on how long it takes the comrades to work out that the fund is really lucrative and they could like skim money out of it like all day long and enrich themselves just from the fund. Who cares about, the actual equity in companies? But let's wait to see what happens. Now, you could say, well, that signals an end of BEE, but the government in typical fashion has come up with a brand new retarded policy in the form of what's now being called the Business Licensing Bill. Now, the Business Licensing Bill of 2025 is described as economic euthanasia, the most destructive, corruption-enabling bill since the Expropriation Bill. So what's the actual purposes of it? Well, the purposes are that every business, formal, informal, home-based, must get a municipal business license. And that means that business inspectors will gain sweeping powers to spot check, seize stock, close a business, and issue fines up to 100,000 Rand on the spot. And municipalities would effectively become gatekeepers for all commerce. Well, I can't see what would go wrong there. Anyway, critics are arguing that it will supercharge corruption like no dare, and it will kill hundreds of thousands of small businesses and allow municipalities to shake down traders and entrepreneurs. Anything to get the government more control in the private sector, right? I mean, you can see that Soviet-style control being played out everywhere. Now, GNU parties, which include the DA, are accused of being asleep or complicit in the bill, because they are. Where's their whole rhetoric around this and their attacks of the stupidity that is the state? Now, you have to understand, for all of you who are like, oh, screw this, I'm immigrating, it's not actually as bad as it sounds. Like, we're here to tell you what the worst case scenario is, but you need to understand, like, according to billionaire Christo, South Africa itself does have an optimistic outlook, and South Africa could become unrecognizable within a year if the government just stopped blocking the private sector. In other words, get rid of BEE and stop with the licensing bull rubbish and just footsack. Now, the country has survived many close calls, according to Christo, and he calls it a lucky nation. Now, most South Africans are decent and hardworking, and the private sector is vibrant and capable, often doing what the state cannot. And his message is, you shouldn't underestimate South Africa's resilience, and if ideology loosens its grip, economic revival is possible. Now, the crux of the matter here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the ANC's polling is now at the lowest it's ever been. No one likes them, and the policies that they keep trying to put in place to have centralized control, Soviet-style modeling to have complete control of the state, are exactly what's causing the state to crumble and the international community to look at Ramaphosa and say, what a prick. And the reality is, it cannot last. And so everybody can see that, and no one likes the ANC. So the upshot of this is, well, 2029, we're probably going to say goodbye to the ANC, and not a day too soon, in my opinion. Anyway, that's just my view. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. And until next time, bye.